Hey everyone, in this video lecture, we are going to be talking about Mendelian inheritance. So it is only fitting that we start by talking about the guy himself who came up with pretty much all of what we know today about modern genetics came from Gregor Mendel. His theories came from his work that he did performing multiple experiments with pea plants. And he was looking at inheritance of traits by combining different plants that had different traits and looking at the traits of their offspring. And through his work, he came up with 4 conclusions. And these conclusions really are what are the basis for genetics and heredity that we understand today. So we're going to go through each of the 4 conclusions and talk about what he learned and what that means about inheritance patterns. So his first conclusion states that traits are controlled by pairs of heritable factors, which to us, we know them as genes, but back when Gregor Mendel was doing his work, they didn't know what DNA was, he didn't know what a gene was. So he knew that there must be some sort of heritable factor that came in different versions, which today we refer to those different versions as alleles. And we'll talk about alleles in more detail. So basically what he was saying is that you have chromosomes, again, but didn't know what a chromosome was. Our chromosomes contain genes, and they are what we inherit from our parents, and that will determine your physical traits. So a gene being a section on a chromosome with certain letters in your DNA that tell you which version of a trait you have. So there's a section on a chromosome that is the gene for eye color, and that will dictate what trait or phenotype you have for eye color, which in this example here would be blue. Could be the same chromosome or a different chromosome, you have a gene for hair color, and that then would determine what trait you show for hair color. So again, he figured all this out by doing his crosses with pea plants, but didn't actually understand what DNA was because it just wasn't discovered back then. And so related to this is that offspring must inherit 2 sets of chromosomes. One set must have come from the egg, one set must have come from the sperm. Because when that egg and sperm join together during fertilization, that newly formed offspring, called a zygote, must be diploid. So he knew that those traits were inherited in those pairs. And so just to kind of reiterate here, what we're looking at with these chromosome pairs, so that offspring, the zygote, that newly formed offspring cell, has, in this case, only 2 pairs of chromosomes. There's homologous pair number 1. The blue was the maternal copy. It came from the egg that created this offspring. The green is the paternal copy. It came from the sperm. The second homologous pair, same thing. The blue version of the chromosome was inherited from the egg. The green was inherited from the sperm. So Mendel was able to figure out that there must be pairs of these factors that we are inheriting. And each chromosome might have a different version of each gene, each trait, if you will. And so the alleles that we now know are different versions of the trait. So an allele is, if there's a gene for eye color, there are multiple alleles for what eye color you may have. You might have the allele for brown eyes. You might have the allele for blue eyes. There's different versions of that gene. And so we represent that allele by using a letter genetically. So brown, and we're going to talk about dominance and recessive just in a second, but brown, we're using the uppercase B letter. In blue, we represent the allele by the little b letter. And so every person is going to inherit 2 alleles for every gene because they have those homologous pairs of chromosomes. You inherit 1 allele from the egg, 1 allele from the sperm. And so if you have 2 different alleles that you inherit for eye color in this example, we say that your gene is heterozygous. So this person inherited a allele of big B, the brown allele, and they also inherited the little b allele. And this is because their parents might have brown eyes, one might have blue eyes. So this person inherited 2 different copies of the same gene. You potentially could also be homozygous, meaning you inherit the same two alleles from your parents. So this individual inherited both big B and big B alleles, both the brown allele. Or you could have inherited both little b alleles, okay, two of the blue alleles. So heterozygous, the alleles that you inherit are different. Homozygous, you inherited two of the same alleles. Again, the fact that you have two alleles comes from the fact that you have one copy of the chromosome from the egg, the maternal side, and one copy came from the sperm. So this is all what we've deduced from Gregor Mendel's first conclusion. His second conclusion says that one version of a factor, the dominant form, could mask the presence of another version, the recessive form. And again, factor back then was referring to that he didn't know what DNA was, didn't know what a gene was. So for us, when we hear factor, think DNA or gene. So he's basically saying that this is his principle of dominance conclusion, that some of the alleles may be dominant, some alleles are recessive. So dominant alleles is the version of a trait that is always going to show up. It's always expressed. And because it's dominant, we are going to represent that allele with the uppercase letters. Whereas recessive alleles are only going to show up if you have two copies of that recessive allele. And we represent it by lowercase letters. So here's an example of the homologous pair of chromosomes that this person inherited. They inherited a big B allele for brown eyes, and they inherited a little b allele for blue eyes. So they have a big B and a little b allele. They are heterozygous. So we represent their genotype by the allele letters, so big B, little b. And the phenotype, the trait that this person actually is going to show, is brown. And that is because big B is dominant over little b, so you show the dominant trait. The only way that you're going to show the recessive trait is to have two recessive alleles, two lowercase b's, two blue alleles. So recessive will only show up if you have both recessive alleles. His third conclusion is that the two paired factors separate during gamete production, causing each gamete, either sperm or egg, to randomly receive just one factor. So to put that in modern day terms, we call this his law of segregation conclusion. And what he's saying is that during meiosis, the haploid gametes, whether we're making sperm or egg, it's going to randomly inherit one copy of each gene, or in this case, each allele. And that has to do with that random lining up of chromosomes during metaphase. So if this was the diploid cell that was going to create sex cells, this person has the big B, little b allele for eye color. So they would have brown eyes, but they have one dominant allele, one recessive allele. During meiosis, these chromosomes will separate, and the end product, these haploid sex cells, will only have one copy of each chromosome. It is random whether this one got the big B or little b allele. So this one happened to get the big B one, this one happened to get the little b one. So each sex cell can only have one copy of each chromosome. So one has the big B allele, one has the little b allele. Same thing over here. If we're making sperm, this person has big B, little b. When this cell goes through meiosis to make the haploid sperm cells, one sperm cell is going to have the big B allele, one sperm cell is going to have the little b allele. So each gamete only gets one allele. So if they happen to be different alleles, those sex cells will have different alleles. Whereas if this was a big B genotype, the sex cells would all be big B because there's no difference. His fourth and final conclusion is that the factors controlling different traits are inherited independently of one another, which this goes back to the law of independent assortment. If you have traits that are on different chromosomes, those chromosomes line up randomly, which causes the genes, which in this case would really mean the alleles, on the different chromosomes to sort independently of one another, meaning they're not linked together. So in this example, this chromosome pair has a gene that we're representing with the letter R. The blue chromosome has the dominant version of the gene. The red has the recessive. There's a separate chromosome pair down here. The blue had the dominant again, and the red had the recessive version of this Y gene. These genes are not linked. The R is separate from the Y gene, which means when we go to create our sex cells during meiosis, that random assortment, the random way they line up, means we can get completely random pairs of these chromosomes. We could create sex cells that are big R, big Y. We could create sex cells that are little r, little y. It's also possible that this was the arrangement of the way that the cells lined up. So it's very possible that we get big R, little y, as well as little r, big Y. These chromosomes, because they're different genes on different chromosomes, it's random what the sex cells get for each allele. So we could have one that makes big R, big Y. We could get one that has little r, big Y. It is completely random because of the way those chromosomes separate during meiosis. And because of all of these conclusions that Mendel put together, we can actually predict the traits of offspring after fertilization of a sperm and egg. And we can use a Punnett square. It's a tool that will allow us to take all of Mendel's conclusions and predict what offspring will have which traits. And so what we have to do is we use one side of the Punnett square for the male and female that are going to create this offspring. It doesn't matter if you put the male on the side and female at the top. It doesn't matter as long as one parent's on the side, one parent's on the top. And so we're going to put, if this female, the trait that we want to predict in the offspring is for flower color, if we're looking at Mendel's flowers, this female flower has the big P, little p genotype. It's showing the trait of purple flowers because purple is dominant over white. And during meiosis, when we create the sex cells, we already saw that one of the conclusions says each sex cell is going to randomly get one allele from the parent. So it is possible that we create sex cells with the big P allele, and it's also possible to create sex cells with the little p allele. So we have to look at both options because we don't know which egg is actually going to create the offspring. We know that both are possible. The male, same genotype, big P, little p. So it is very likely that this individual could create sex cells that have the big P dominant allele. It's also possible to create sperm cells that have the recessive little p allele. So again, we need to look at all the options here because we don't know actually which sex cell will be used to create the offspring. So step one is you put the gametes with their individual alleles on the outside of the Punnett square. Step two is you take the gametes, the alleles from each parent gamete, and we're going to represent fertilization, that sperm and egg combining to see what the diploid offspring cell would potentially have. So we're going to take the row and the column of alleles, and we're going to combine them in the box. Okay, so in this box, I'm going to have big P, the big P from the sperm, big P from the egg, combined, fertilized, create this offspring that is big P, big P. And you repeat this for the rest of the boxes. And so now we're going to fill in not only the genotypes for every box. In this box, the big P from the egg would be combining with the little p from the sperm. We are also going to identify the phenotype, so what each trait would be based on that particular genotype. And we see down here in this box, this little p from the egg and this little p from the sperm had combined, creating a genotype of little p. That would mean this offspring would show the recessive phenotype, which in this case is a white flower. And so now we can take this Punnett square and come up with probabilities. So if those two flowers were to mate and produce offspring, what is the probability they get each genotype and phenotype? So for genotypes, the probability of getting an offspring from these two parents showing big P genotype is 1 out of 4 possibilities, or a 25% chance. For big P, little p as a genotype, there's a 2 out of 4 chance, or 50% chance these two parents would create an offspring with the big P, little p genotype. And then lastly, the little p genotype is only 1 out of 4, or a 25% chance of occurring. We can repeat this with the phenotypes. So purple, there's a 3 out of 4 chance here, or 75% chance that the offspring these two flowers would produce is purple. And for white, there's only 1 out of 4 offspring in this box, representing a 25% chance that the flowers would mate and produce, the two purple flowers would mate and produce a white offspring. So I recommend pausing, or it is the end of the video here, doing some Punnett square practice, coming up with genotype and phenotype probabilities, practicing these Punnett squares.